Good evening. It is 5:30 PM on Tuesday, November 1st, 2022. And this regular meeting of the Sandpoint Planning and Zoning Commission is now called to order in council chambers at City Hall, 1123 West Lake Street, Sandpoint, Idaho. For the record, I am Chairman John Hastings presiding. Also present are Commissioners Slate Camp, Luke Ahmet, Amelia Boyd, Ben McGran. Commissioners absent, Mo Stunkel, and I was asking about Nick if he's on remote or not yet.
Sure. Yes.
Okay, and Nick Polito attending remotely. We will now recite the Pledge of Allegiance. If everyone will please stand.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And I think I can skip over the announcement here again, but with none of the public is here in attendance, but we are working on getting improved sound systems here in the council chambers. But at this point, I don't need to go into those details. Are there any other general announcements for the commissioners, from the commissioners, or from city staff? All righty. Next on the agenda is approval of the meeting minutes. I will first entertain a motion to approve the minutes from the October 18th, 2022 meeting.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right. Clerk, please call roll.
Commissioner Boyd,
Yes.
Commissioner Omat,
Yes.
Commissioner Polito,
yes,
Commissioner Camp,
Yes.
Commissioner McGran,
yes,
Chairman Hastings.
Yes. The motion passes. The next item on the agenda this evening is an overview of workshops held last week on housing and neighborhoods. I will now yield the floor to City Planner Amy Tweeten for an introduction of this agenda item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We did hold the 2 workshops last week. There we go. We had just over 35 people on the 2 days. At each workshop, we provided information on previous input that was given during the comprehensive plan process early on. What are some existing housing solutions for infill that currently exist, such as accessory dwelling units, original lots of record, single family attached housing, information on zoning districts, current housing developments that are currently in the pipeline. And then we were seeking information on infill housing through a variety of methods. We had a visual preference survey, a questionnaire on support for code changes to remove barriers for infill construction, and then just a general question board on neighborhood likes and needed improvements. Overall, the input provided on code changes to remove barriers to housing construction. There was strong support for ADUs, increasing the size to 2 bedrooms and incentivizing construction. There was general support for townhouse style buildings for infill. There was support for construction on substandard original lots of record. There was some support for allowing 2 stories in all residential districts, and I'll explain that a little bit. But there was very little support for increasing the number of multifamily units that qualified as a permitted rather than a conditional use, which the threshold, oops, I put 4, that's 7 actually. Currently 7 in any of the districts that reference multifamily standards. So the question on the 2 stories in all residential districts was getting at the language in the code that currently requires you stepping a building. If it's a 1-story building, it's supposed to be 1.5 stories, when truly building code doesn't have a 2-story or doesn't have a 1.5 stories. So just allowing 2 stories in any, so if it's a multifamily development, it can be 2 stories. We'd want to probably look at, if it goes 3 stories, what are additional provisions we put in place? Is it you have to have a larger setback? Or other ways to break up the facade, but overall, the 2 stories had support. Again, we had a very small sample size, but that was the feedback we got. On the visual preference, these were 3 images that had a high level of support, somewhere between 93 and 100% of the people that responded to these. 2 of them were at 100% positive or would support this type of infill. And then 1 was just at 93%. The other ones were all probably 70, 80%. I think there was 1 that was about 50-50%. What would improve neighborhood? This is just a list of things that people put, and I just highlighted the word that popped up a lot, which is no surprise, which is sidewalks. But there was a wide variety of comments on that, dealing with roundabouts, enforcement, parking, diversity, and then on what people like about their neighborhood. Interesting, similar to what would improve a neighborhood. It's walking, trails, sidewalks. Then we had just a general comments, and this is a wide range of comments that were provided. Some of these, again, are getting back to ADUs or increasing density. And what was interesting, again, is we had the boards from early input in the engagement. And this is a word cloud from that. This was a question looking out 20 years. What does a livable neighborhood in Sandpoint look like to you? So it very much is similar input to what was provided early in the process. So again, because we did get very little input, what we can do, because we have a questionnaire and then we have the visual preference, we can put both of those together. We can do an online survey with the same information. Might be a little more challenging because there was a lot of interaction with people at the workshop, kind of explaining what the information was, what does an original lot mean, what does it look like. So we can try to take as much of that information and we'll put it on, we'll create a survey from it. The other issue is just getting it live sooner than later, because the longer we're getting input, we'll have to come back to the Housing and Neighborhoods chapter after all this input is finished. So probably worthwhile given the limited input we did get at the workshops. But realistically, the people that came to the workshops were engaged and interested, and so it was worthwhile doing. Had we had more time to promote it, obviously would have been better. But Sarah did a fabulous job. She went to all the downtown businesses, dropped off flyers. We had 2 articles in the Reader, so we appreciate that. But again, engagement can be a challenge, but it takes a lot of effort too. So we will do what we can to get additional input on that. If you have any questions.
I have a question. Just briefly, broad strokes. Currently, where in Sandpoint is it restricted to 1 story currently, whereas 2 and or 3 stories allowed.
Currently, there's nowhere that only allows 1 story. So
Okay.
the single family districts allow, it doesn't give stories, but it's 35 feet. So you're gonna
Correct.
have a single family home or a duplex or an ADU, all can be 35 feet. And in the RM district, it's 40 feet. So it's really just the complicating factor of the story and a half that. we're
I may
trying to
have, well,
address.
yeah, and I may have been not reading it correctly, but I thought in some of the early, on an earlier slide, it said something about where restricted to 1 story. Or was that public comment that there
I
was
think
people that
was,
were in favor of restricting certain neighborhoods to 1 story?
I don't know.
And
It was the question. So the
Okay.
question was support for allowing 2 stories in all residential districts, which we do now. And that, I mean,
that's
that,
what I thought, that already
takes
is
some-
that way.
but technically a multifamily building can't be 2 stories if it's surrounded by single family dwellings. By, the way the letter of the code reads, the interpretation has been you can't technically have a story and a half.
Right.
So. So one other thing, unless there's other questions.
I think the question I have is, first, I'd like to thank you guys for being out there in the community and taking the effort and having the visuals. It was great to see that. So thank you for doing that. On the survey piece, the additional survey piece, what are we hoping to achieve? Are we trying to get further input into information that would inform the comp plan? And like, can you give an example of what this potential survey would look like? Would it be similar questions that have been asked in the past to?
It would actually be the exact same information that was at the workshop.
Okay,
So it'd be the questionnaire on, so really the questions were around, let me find. So there were questions on, do you support current ADU regulations? Do you support changes to ADU regulations? And then there was a question about townhouse construction. And there was a question on substandard original lots record. And then there was a question about allowing 2 stories. And then, so these bullet points were what the questions were.
Okay.
So those would also appear in the survey. And then it would also be the visual preference survey on the attached housing that we had on the walls.
gotcha.
Essentially, that's what the survey would be.
Okay. And you would try to broadcast that, give everybody a week or 2 to respond.
And we'd
and-
probably put it out for a couple weeks.
Seems reasonable. I guess it wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, it may push us out a little bit, but yeah, I mean, and part of it, I know the interest of the commission moving the ADUs forward, and at least the input we have now certainly gives us support for doing that. So going back to council with the changes.
Was that question worded as increasing to 2 bedrooms with no mention of square footage, or was there a square footage number involved or not?
It was just, do you support current regulations? And and that was the other thing, we had a lot of information on current regulations. And I don't know how, I guess we can put that in front of the question on the survey. And then it was, do you support changes? And what would those changes be? So we didn't lead into any changes.
Gotcha.
So if there's no other questions.
I have a question. I'm just figuring out how I'm gonna frame it here. So strong support for ADUs. So ADUs implies that another family is going to potentially be living in it in like a single family residential zone neighborhood. So is there objections to that, or is it, from maybe other owners of single family residence? How do you handle that on the city level?
You mean if someone builds an ADU and then afterwards the neighbor is upset?
I mean, it's possible, right? Because they could
It's
say this
possible.
is a single family residential neighborhood.
Right?
And then my second question to that is some support for allowing 2 stories in all residential districts. And I don't recall ever seeing that there was a restriction on that. So you can expand the size of your house. And in some cases, maybe even the footprint by, going up a second story. To me, that doesn't necessarily imply, a second family is going to move in. To me, it says that they're just, maybe building a house for a bigger family. And I know that I have a question in there somewhere. Because allowing 2 stories in all residential districts. But it's allowed.
It is allowed. So I may need to tweak that question to make it clearer. Because we do currently allow 2 stories in single family and multiple family districts. But there's just this feeling that a multiple family district next to a single family district or a multiple family building next to a single family district should be held to a different height requirement.
And
So I'm
then,
trying to get at, should there be some consistency across it shouldn't be use related. It should be, if you're gonna allow this height, it should be for any structure. But it may be if you allow more height, you have to increase your, so there might be other ways to deal with the issue that people have with infill for larger structures.
and I heard that story in the half thing again. We had a conversation a long time ago about that
Yes.
and how it was deceptive, but there's just no such thing. Okay, that's all I have.
So I just wanted to briefly touch on, because we had the discussion
Actually,
about.
could I ask one
Oh.
more question? Because I was curious about it before too, and that was it said there was support for, I don't know if that was widespread or one comment, quite honestly, but it said there was support for tiny homes and or even tiny home developments.
There was a comment.
That was just a
That was a
comment.
comment that we should allow tiny homes and tiny home communities. That was one of the general.
And currently, what's the status of what would be allowed or not allowed?
You have to have it on a foundation.
Yep.
So we don't have a minimum size. You could build a really small house on in fact, we show one of the images we had was of the ADU on Pine Street. Well, you could call that a tiny house. But they do have to be on a foundation. And I think a lot of tiny house communities, they're more, they're almost mobile because they come in on wheels.
I think they come in that way, but I think most of the jurisdictions around here require the same thing, that they have to be on a foundation. But that's a pretty,
Mhm.
And would that fall under the cottage ordinance?
Well, the cottage ordinance still does require a foundation.
Right.
Yeah. And we did ask about that, or we gave information on our cottage development regulations as well. I think that's a part of the code we'll probably look at, because while it has some really specific requirements, but it isn't necessarily resulting in a layout that is all that you would expect. But part of it is just the restrictions of the lot. So you have to have so much common open space, and all the units have to face that open space. But it isn't, you see images of cottage developments elsewhere, and it's completely a different product that we're seeing than a true cottage development.
and current code on any lot, whether it's, I'm getting at ADUs and perhaps even at tiny homes sort of thing. There's no change in the total footprint, the total area that can be covered when you're, if you're adding an ADU, you still have to abide by the current code and in terms of how much is covered space and how much is not, correct?
In terms of lot coverage and
Yes.
pervious area, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, that did not change. So the one other thing that I wanted to touch on was, because we had the discussion on implementation and how do we go from this discussion of goals and objectives in the different chapter to actually how do we get this done? And I just wanted to share, if I can find it. Sort of, okay, so how the current comprehensive plan so the current comprehensive plan also has, the various chapters, and it is goals, policies, and then chapter 12 of the current plan is implementation. So that's where it goes from those, and then it gets into an actual table where it talks about, the project, the policy, there was a policy recommendation somewhere in land use that talked about development regulations. So the project is actually development regulations update. And so that then, if you recall how Miriam discussed it, this is the direction we're going for implementation for the new plan. There'll be a chapter just on implementation, but it refers back to all the previous chapters. And if there was a policy statement about protecting downtown character, there would be a strategy for how to do that. If it's create a downtown historic district, that would be the program or project. We talk, what's the summary? What are the goals and objectives it meets in the plan? Then who's the lead on getting that done? What's the priority and what's the timeline? So that's how it is in the current plan. But then just to give you an example, when chapter 13, which was the airport chapter, was added, it was done a little differently just so they didn't have to go back and amend the full body. But so for this, it's the same. So here's the airport chapter. It gives the background information. It gets into the goals and policies. And then it has its own implementation action plan. So this is just the airport, but this is how all of the chapters would move from policy to what's the actual action we're going to take to get beyond just a broad, we'd like to do this. So then there's the project program. What's a summary of it? Where is it referenced in the document? Who's responsible? Priority, and then an estimate of the timeline. So there's two different ways to do it, but I think the way we were leaning is to have a separate chapter or even an appendix, because otherwise each chapter is going to be so long of it as its own implementation table in addition to all the goals and objectives. So it really would be, I mean, the implementation might be the main section that some people, I just want to see how it's going to get done. And they're less interested in all the background information, goals and objectives.
When was the airport one? Wasn't this recently added?
2019.
I would be interested to hear status on these.
Well, some of the, I mean, a lot of the we didn't proper, but out of this, the airport zoning was created. We created the district. So we did this we did the airport overlay zone. So that was completed. We did not do a transfer. We require fair disclosure statements for anyone in any of the airport overlay zones. We don't have design guidelines.
There was some land acquisition too, wasn't there?
From the county, there was, they count, they
The one of
purchased
the-
that
yes.
property at the very end of the
What I thought,
runway
yeah.
by Schweitzer Cutoff.
Which was one of the objectives listed here, so.
Yeah. Uh,
That's an interesting one, the construction assistance. Go back up a little bit. Construction assistance grants. Yeah, I think that this is a concept of things that we're looking at of how do we incentivize people to build certain types of homes, right?
Right.
It'd be interesting to hear if there's been any
I don't think
movement
there's
on
been
that.
any action on that item, but yeah, because the text talks about the importance of the airport as an economic driver and so other than just the noise abatement, how do we leverage it for economic development?
And just as an interesting fact, because I was around at that time, so it was here too, but did you know that the Sandpoint Airport is the second busiest airport in Idaho? The Boise Airport's the only one
Oh.
that's bigger and busier.
Really?
That's
It's
That's why it's such an economic
Yeah.
power for the
Yeah.
area. Now, that surprised me.
busier than
Yeah.
Coeur d'Alene.
Yeah.
Huh.
At least it was at the time. Don't know if it still is, but it
Yeah.
was when we were going through this. but
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we know there's a lot of chapters to this plan, which means there's a lot of implementation steps, so
But-
it does tend to be why you have to come back and revisit the plan every few years because priorities on implementation particularly would change.
Right. Well, and I think if you go back to the comp plans implementation matrix there and kind of grade where we're at with that, right? It says
Yep.
these were the however many things there were, 10, 20, whatever it was, and say we did these things, but we didn't do these and maybe a reason why. I think that'd be interesting to help us inform when we're creating our implementation plan,
Mhm.
those things to consider, right?
And I think the implementation items that weren't completed in the current plan have been pulled over. But we may need to revisit them as
Yeah.
well.
What's the old saying? Like if it's not managed, it's not.
If it's not measured, it's not managed.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was just wondering, because you, Amy, said that some of these are done. Now, somewhere there's got to be a log or a record or some kind of, live functionality that shows what's done and what hasn't started on these.
I don't know that exists, no. But I think that's when you revisit it, so our chapter on the airport, that's basically pulling this, we'll have to update this table.
Mm.
And maybe some of the
It's like it needs to have milestones included.
Yeah.
Just for points of reference for accomplishment.
it's true.
With some of these, I don't know if with all of them, but it also might be useful when we talk about measuring success or implementation of this. When the responsibility says City of Sandpoint, it might be beneficial if that was more specific. If this falls in the building department, or does this fall in the which department? I mean, there should be a position associated with that responsibility instead of the City of Sandpoint.
Right, and it is, developing the implementation table needs a lot of staff input because it's like, well, no, that wasn't my priority. Did you know that this was a priority and you were excited?
We put it on the
It's like
table.
it needs, does the city use the Smart Sheets program? It's
No.
how it does it, like when it's your turn, it's highlighted, you accomplish it.
Right.
Push it on to the next. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to go buy a software program to do this, but it's interesting. The conversation's interesting for, measuring that accomplishment.
And it could well be when they started the planning process, that they did go through the current plan and said accomplished, 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 accomplished. Yeah. Because a lot of them, you know, if you look at the current table, okay, so we've got,
And this one is more specific. This one will say the mayor, or it will say the planning
says
department. It-
planning, okay. so
Yeah.
there's interim zoning. I don't know what that referred to. Development regulation, so, oops, development regulations update. So likely, well, no, I do know zoning for sure was updated after the comp plan. I don't know about subdivision. ACI agreement, annual review of implementation plan. I think that became the strategic plan more. The adoption of intergovernmental agreements, public land acquisition, review and adopt urban area transportation plan, that happened. They did a park and rec master plan. I don't know if there's an acquisition map, integrated trails map, downtown plan, bypass happened. Street standards, there's the downtown streetscape study and implementation. US corridor 2, grade separation, that did not happen. There was the historic district. There was an expansion of the historic district that did occur. But the zoning controls that did not. I don't know about an incentives program. Update of the comp plan. So a lot of these things did. Seems like kind of a short implementation plan, actually. I think our implementation table is going to be a bit longer than this, but there is, you know, I mean, in every chapter we know there's overlap and a lot of the strategies go across a lot of different chapters as well. So hopefully that helps.
At what point or when do you think that we'll be at the point of developing the implementation matrix? Is that in a month? Is that
I'd
6
like
months?
to
Is
get
that
a draft of all the chapters, so that we at least know like some of the goals and objectives in all of them. So the goal for that, I think, is early December. Because then we have a few months. We still have to do the ACI agreement. We have to do the future land use and growth. And so I think once there's a good draft of all the chapters, then we can get a good, and Miriam said they've been placed. So whenever we're discussing different chapters, or they had been previously discussing, they were pulling things that people were saying and kind of saying that sounds like an implementation item. So they've kind of been keeping a running total. It's just winnowing it down to not be way more than you could even accomplish in 20 years, let alone 5. So
is that the kind of the window is the 5 years is?
3 to 5 years, you're going to want to review.
Yeah.
But the window of the whole plan is about a 20-year horizon.
But the rewrite is still supposed to be every 10 years, even though it's a 20-year plan. Is that not correct?
Say that again.
The entire comprehensive plan is supposed to be redone every 10 years, even though it's a 20-year plan.
Correct.
I mean, by statute, that's what it has to
Right.
get redone every 10 years, even though it's a 20-year plan.
Yeah, the major revision, but making sure you're reviewing it more frequently than that.
Right.
So that is all I had.
Commissioners have any other questions for staff?
I'd like to advocate that we utilize appendixes as much as possible to keep the plan concise.
Use appendices as much as possible. Okay.
Anything else? If not, we can adjourn this meeting at 6:05. Thank you all very much.
Nice to see you. I was hoping we were-